The sharp crack of the bailiff's voice cut through the murmur of the courtroom like a blade through silk. All rise. The command echoed off the high ceiling of the Fulton County Superior Courthouse, bouncing between the polished oak panels and the marble columns that had witnessed decades of justice, injustice, and everything in between. Everyone in the packed courtroom stood as Judge Malcolm Harrington entered through the door behind the bench. His black robe draped over the sides of his wheelchair with practiced precision, the fabric pooling slightly at the edges. The wheels clicked softly but deliberately against the polished hardwood floor, each rotation a reminder of the decade that had passed since the accident that changed everything. At 64 years old, Harrington's grey eyes still carried an authority capable of silencing an entire room with a single glance. The lines etched into his face told stories of countless verdicts, sleepless nights reviewing case files, and the weight of decisions that altered lives forever. His salt and pepper hair, cropped close and professional, framed a face that had long ago learned to hide emotion behind a mask of judicial impartiality. His legs hadn't worked in 10 years, not since that rainy November evening when a drunk driver ran a red light and changed the trajectory of his life in an instant. But his sentences remained merciless, his interpretation of the law unflinching, especially against men like the one standing before him that day. Elijah Brooks stood at the defense table, a man in his late 30s whose eyes held a peculiar mixture of resignation and quiet dignity. His faded orange prison jumpsuit hung loosely on a frame that had once been more robust, the fabric worn thin from countless washings in industrial machines. His wrists were shackled, the metal cuffs connected by a short chain that clinked softly whenever he moved. His hands, calloused and strong despite months of incarceration, rested on the scarred wooden surface of the defense table. To most people in the courtroom that morning, the prosecutors and court staff who had seen hundreds of cases just like this one, Elijah was just another repeat offender, another statistic in a system overburdened with cases and understaffed with defenders. Another black man in orange who would soon be another black man in prison stripes. He had been charged with obstruction of justice, fraud, and resisting arrest. The charges themselves were vague, built on a foundation of witness statements that contradicted each other and police reports filled with convenient gaps. But in a system where the burden of proof often shifted depending on who you were and what you looked like, vague was often enough. To Harrington, sitting in his elevated position behind the bench, this was a simple case, cut and dried, open and shut. The evidence, such as it was, pointed toward guilt. The defendant had a history, a record that stretched back years, filled with minor offenses that painted a picture of someone who couldn't stay out of trouble. The law was clear, the sentence would be severe. The prosecutor rose to her feet, her tailored grey suit crisp and professional, her blonde hair pulled back into a tight bun that spoke of efficiency and no-nonsense competence. She was young, ambitious, the kind of attorney who saw cases not as human stories, but as stepping stones in a career that would eventually lead to a corner office and a name on the door. Her voice, when she spoke, was crisp and confident, each word enunciated with the clarity of someone who knew she had already won. Your Honor, the state recommends no less than 15 years in a state correctional facility. The defendant has wasted this court's time with false claims of wrongful arrest and procedural misconduct. He has lied repeatedly about who he is, about what he can supposedly do, about his identity and his abilities. He has shown no remorse, no accountability, no recognition of the severity of his actions. It's time he faces the full consequences of his choices. Elijah stared at the table in silence, his jaw tight, his eyes focused on a small scratch in the wood that looked like it might have been carved there by someone's fingernail. Perhaps another defendant from another case, leaving their mark on a system that would soon leave its mark on them. His public defender, a tired woman in her 50s with grey roots showing through brown dye and coffee stains on her sleeve, said nothing. She had given up hours earlier, during the lunch recess, when she had looked at Elijah with exhausted eyes and said there was nothing more she could do, that the system had already decided, that fighting further would only make things worse. Her briefcase sat closed on the table beside her, the files inside barely reviewed, the defense she might have mounted never fully formed. Harrington straightened in his chair, his hands gripping the armrests with the practiced ease of someone who had learned to compensate for the loss of lower body strength with increased upper body power. He was ready to deliver the sentence, the words already forming in his mind, the familiar rhythm of judicial pronouncement that he had delivered hundreds of times before. "Mr. Brooks, you have been found guilty. The court hereby sentences you to." But he never finished that sentence. The courtroom doors at the back of the room creaked open with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the tense silence. Small footsteps echoed against the walls, each one distinct and clear, the soft padding of small shoes against hard floor. Heads turned in unison, a wave of curiosity rippling through the gallery. A little black girl, no more than 7 years old, walked in wearing a light blue dress that looked like it had been carefully pressed that morning, perhaps by grandmother's hands or loving fingers that wanted her to look her best. The fabric was simple cotton, nothing expensive, but clean and cared for. Her hair was braided into 2 neat pigtails that swung gently with each step, the ends tied with matching blue ribbons. Her face held a seriousness that seemed far beyond her years, an expression of determination and purpose that belonged on someone much older. She was completely alone. No adult accompanied her, no hand held hers, no guardian stood behind her explaining her presence or apologizing for the interruption. She didn't stop at the threshold to take in the intimidating space of the courtroom with its high ceilings and formal atmosphere. She didn't look around at the faces turning toward her, with expressions ranging from confusion to amusement to irritation. She just walked straight down the center aisle with purpose and precision, past stunned lawyers in expensive suits, past spectators who had come to watch justice be served or perverted, depending on their perspective, past the wooden railing that separated the gallery from the well of the court, until she stopped directly in front of the judge's elevated bench. She had to tilt her head back to look up at him, her neck craning at an angle that must have been uncomfortable, but her gaze never wavered. Harrington's brow furrowed deeply, creating valleys between his eyebrows. His mouth opened slightly in surprise, an expression rarely seen on a face that had been trained for decades to reveal nothing. "Who is this child?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of genuine confusion mixed with the beginning of irritation. This was highly irregular, unprecedented even. Before anyone in the courtroom could answer, before the bailiff could move to intervene, before the prosecutor could object to this bizarre interruption, the little girl looked up at him with eyes that were simultaneously ancient and innocent, calm and steady, filled with a knowing that shouldn't have been possible in someone so young. "Let my father go," she said, her voice clear and unwavering despite her small size, "and I will make you walk." The words hung in the air for a moment, suspended in the space between impossible and unthinkable. Then laughter erupted from the back of the room, starting as a few scattered chuckles and building into genuine laughter that echoed off the wooden panels and marble columns. Someone at the prosecution table chuckled and shook their head, the sound mixing with the laughter from the gallery. Even one of the bailiffs, a grizzled veteran who had seen everything in his 20 years working courthouse security, couldn't suppress a smile that tugged at the corners of his mouth. The absurdity of it, a child making such a preposterous claim, offering such an impossible bargain, was too much for the formal atmosphere to contain. Harrington blinked in surprise, his grey eyes widening slightly before narrowing again. "What did you say?" he asked, leaning forward in his wheelchair, certain he must have misheard, that the child had said something else, something that made sense. "I said, if you let him go," she repeated without hesitation, her voice remaining firm and steady despite the laughter still echoing around her. "I will make you walk." Her small hands hung at her sides, relaxed and confident, as if she had just offered the most reasonable trade in the world. "This is not a place for fairy tales," Harrington said sharply, his tone hardening into the voice he used to restore order when courtroom proceedings threatened to devolve into chaos. "This is a court of law, not a stage for children's fantasies. Officer, please remove the girl immediately." He gestured to the nearest bailiff with a wave of his hand that expected instant compliance. But before the bailiff could take more than a step forward, Elijah's voice cut through the air, raw and desperate, filled with an emotion that made several people in the gallery sit up straighter. "Please, let her speak," he said, his voice cracking on the words. His eyes, which had been downcast and defeated moments before, now blazed with something between hope and terror. "Faith, baby, you shouldn't be here." "Sit down, Mr. Brooks," Harrington snapped back, his judicial authority reasserting itself. "You are in enough trouble without adding contempt of court to your charges." But even as he said it, the little girl continued speaking, ignoring the judge's command with the fearlessness of childhood innocence, or perhaps something deeper. "Nobody listens to my daddy," she said. And now there was a note of pleading in her voice, a crack in the confident facade that revealed the scared child beneath. "They don't know who he really is. They don't see what I see. He helped people before all this happened. He made them better when they were sick and sad. He made broken things whole again. He gave hope to people who had lost it. That's what he does. That's who he is." But then they arrested him, and nobody would listen to what he tried to tell them. Nobody believed him because they couldn't see it. More giggles rippled through the room like wind through grass, the spectators finding entertainment in this unexpected interruption to what had been a routine sentencing hearing. The court reporter, a middle-aged woman who had been transcribing courtroom proceedings for 15 years, lowered her head to hide a smile that she knew was inappropriate but couldn't quite suppress. This was the kind of story she would tell her husband over dinner, the kind of bizarre moment that broke up the monotony of legal proceedings. Harrington glanced at the bailiff, his expression demanding an explanation for how this situation had been allowed to develop. "Why is she here?" he asked, his voice tight with controlled frustration. "Who authorized a child to enter my courtroom during active proceedings? Who let her in? Where is the adult supervision?" "She's his daughter," the bailiff admitted with an apologetic shrug, gesturing toward Elijah. "She came in by herself through the main entrance and wouldn't leave when we asked her to. We tried to stop her at the door, but she's small and quick and determined. She slipped past security during the shift change. By the time we realized what was happening, she was already halfway down the aisle." The judge turned back to her, his grey eyes studying her face with the intensity he usually reserved for evaluating witness credibility. "What is your name, child?" he asked, his tone softening slightly despite his irritation. There was something in her eyes, something he couldn't quite identify, that made him pause. "Faith," she answered simply, the single syllable carrying weight beyond its phonetic simplicity. Her name seemed to settle over the courtroom like a blanket, and the laughter began to die down, replaced by something else, something harder to define. A tension, perhaps, or an anticipation, as if everyone present suddenly realized they might be witnessing something significant. "Faith," Harrington began, choosing his words carefully, trying to find the right balance between firmness and compassion, between maintaining his authority and not traumatizing a child. "I don't know what you think is going to happen here, but this is a court of law. We operate based on evidence and testimony and legal procedure, not wishes or hopes or childhood fantasies. There are rules that must be followed, processes that must be respected. I understand you love your father, but that's not how any of this works." "And that," she replied without missing a beat, her voice steady as stone, "is exactly where it needs to happen. Right here, right now, in this place where people decide what's true and what isn't, where they judge who's guilty and who's innocent. You've been in that chair for 10 years, haven't you?" The question seemed to come out of nowhere. A sudden shift that caught Harrington off guard. His body stiffened, his hands tightening on the armrests of his wheelchair. "That's none of your business," he said. But his voice had lost some of its authority, replaced by something defensive. "You haven't felt your legs since the accident," Faith continued. And now her voice had taken on a different quality, something gentle and knowing, as if she were stating simple facts rather than probing old wounds. "They told you your spine was broken in 3 places, that the damage was irreversible, that the nerves were destroyed, that you'd never walk again. The doctors said it was permanent. They said you should accept it and move on." His lips pressed into a thin line, his jaw clenching. The courtroom had gone completely silent now. The earlier laughter evaporated like morning mist. Every eye was on the small girl and the powerful judge, watching an exchange that had somehow become intensely personal. "But you want to walk," she said softly, and it wasn't a question but a statement of absolute certainty. "You want it more than anything. You dream about it at night. You imagine it every morning when you first wake up, those few seconds before you remember that you can't. You think about what it would feel like to stand on your own 2 feet again, to walk across a room without wheels, to climb stairs, to run if you wanted to. You want it so badly it hurts worse than the accident ever did." Harrington's hands gripped the armrests of his wheelchair with white-knuckled intensity, his breathing becoming slightly labored. "How dare you?" he began, but the words came out weaker than intended. "I'm not here to scare you," Faith continued, and her small hand reached up, palm open in a gesture of peace and offering. "I'm not here to make fun of you or hurt you, but I'm asking for something that nobody else in this room will ask for. I'm asking you to please not hurt my father anymore. He didn't lie about who he is or what he can do. You just didn't believe him, because what he can do doesn't make sense to you, doesn't fit in the boxes you use to understand the world, but that doesn't make it less real." The judge shot a look at Elijah, his jaw rigid with tension, searching the man's face for signs of manipulation, for evidence that this was some kind of elaborate con, that the child had been coached to say these things, to play on emotional vulnerabilities. But Elijah's expression showed only a mixture of fear and hope, the face of a father watching his daughter walk a tightrope without a net. Faith raised her small hand higher, palm up, as if reaching for something invisible floating in the air above her. "If you give him back to me," she whispered, and every person in the courtroom strained to hear her words, "I'll give something back to you, something you lost, something you think is gone forever." Harrington opened his mouth to interrupt her, to call an end to this circus, to restore order and sanity to his courtroom and his life. But he stopped. Something stopped him, because for the first time in 10 long years, for the first time since that rainy November evening when his life changed forever, he felt warmth. Not pain, which he had felt plenty of in the months after the accident, the burning agony of damaged nerves and broken bones. Not the phantom sensations that doctors had warned him about, the ghost memories of feeling that the brain creates to fill the void. Not the tingling that sometimes crawled across his skin like insects, but real, genuine warmth. A slow, steady warmth rising in his knees like heat from a gentle fire, spreading outward in waves. He looked down at his legs, these traitors that had abandoned him, these useless appendages that he had to lift manually to position them, that got in the way more than they helped. His legs weren't moving, the muscles weren't contracting, but the warmth was definitely spreading, climbing up from his knees toward his thighs with deliberate purpose. "What are you doing to me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, no longer the commanding tone of a judge, but the confused question of a man confronting something beyond his understanding. "I'm not doing anything," Faith answered gently, and her eyes held a wisdom that should not have been possible in someone so young. "You've always wanted to walk. Every single day for 10 years you've wanted it. That want never left. That ability never left. It's still there, locked inside you, buried under fear and anger and acceptance of what you think is impossible. I'm just unlocking what's still inside. I'm just reminding your body what it already knows how to do. You're just a child, Harrington said. But the words came out weak, unconvincing even to his own ears. Faith lifted her chin, firm and resolute, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. "And you're afraid," she said, her voice low but strong enough to cut through the thick silence that had settled over the courtroom like snow. Every person present leaned forward slightly, unconsciously, drawn into this impossible moment. "Afraid of what?" Harrington demanded, but there was less challenge in his voice now, more genuine question, as if he really wanted to know the answer. "Of being wrong," Faith said, pausing deliberately between each word, letting them land with precision, letting each syllable echo through the hall of polished wood and cold marble. "Of finding out that the world isn't as small and safe and predictable as you've forced it to be. Of discovering that there are things you can't control with gavels and laws and rules, things you can't explain with logic and evidence and procedure, things that exist anyway, whether you believe in them or not. And maybe you never could control them, and that terrifies you more than the wheelchair ever did." The words fell like the strike of a gavel, final and irreversible. But they weren't directed just at his body, at his paralyzed legs and damaged spine. They were directed at something deeper, at the locked door in his mind that he had refused to open for a decade, the door behind which he had buried everything that couldn't be measured or documented or proven beyond reasonable doubt. Harrington had accepted paralysis not just in his legs, but in his spirit, in his capacity for wonder, in his ability to believe in anything beyond what he could see and touch and verify. The moment he lost the use of his limbs in that accident, he had buried something else along with them. He had buried hope, locked away faith, refused to believe in miracles or mysteries or anything that couldn't be explained by medical science and rational thought. He searched Elijah's face desperately for some sign of denial, some indication that this was a trick, a con, a manipulation designed to prey on his vulnerability. But he found only the calm expression of a man who had been waiting for exactly this moment, who had known it would come, who had perhaps even prepared his daughter for it. "You knew she could do this?" Harrington asked, and his tone had completely changed now, no longer authoritative or angry, but reverent, awed, the voice of someone watching their understanding of reality crack and shift. Elijah swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat, his voice thick with emotion that he had been holding back for months of imprisonment and accusation. "I've seen her do small things," he admitted, his words coming slowly, carefully, as if he were trying to explain something that defied explanation. Things nobody could explain when they saw them happen. Little miracles, people called them, though they tried to find other explanations. Rational ones, coincidences and tricks of light and wishful thinking. A neighbor's child who couldn't hear suddenly could after Faith touched her ear. An old man's arthritis that vanished when she held his hands. A dog hit by a car that was dying, that the vet said couldn't be saved, that got up and